monthly dairy webinar. I'd like to welcome everybody to the program. Today's program is what does this season forage situation look like? Next month, we'll be welcoming Dr. James Coltis from Iowa State to visit with us on what's changing in the new sire summaries. And our last program for 2020 will be stress, generational communication in the family, and that'll be presented by Larry Tranel from Iowa State. When you are logged on, we appreciate if you will mute your mic and disable your camera. If you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box and we'll be addressing them at the end of the presentation. After the program, we invite everybody to please take the evaluation survey, and I'll have that link at the end of the program. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and get out of the sharing mode here, I think.
Okay, so I should go ahead and share my screen.
Am I out?
All right, do you see my first slide now?
Jen, can you tell me? I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, I see it, Neal.
Okay.
It's ready for the presentation mode.
Okay, I'll go ahead and introduce Neal. He's been with Dairyland Labs for about 4.5 years as a feed and forage consultant. In this position, his primary role is to provide technical support to clients and management regarding feed and forage analysis, especially in relation to ruminant nutrition. He also provides some other technical and sales function. Prior to joining Dairyland Labs, he worked in the feed industry as a dairy nutrition consultant for 16.5 years. Neal, welcome to the webinar.
Well, thank you, Fred. We certainly appreciate you inviting us to do the webinar here today with you. I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone that's joining us here, and yeah, welcome any questions at the end or any discussion. So yeah, I guess I'll jump right in here. Fred asked us to speak on what the quality of the 2020 crop year forage is, and in particular corn silage quality is, and looking at 2020 versus historical data. Well, I'm having some technical difficulties with my, there we go. So did everybody see I advanced slide? All right.
Yeah, you're going.
Okay. All right, thank you. So yeah, kind of like I mentioned, the main forage that we're kind of going to cover today is corn silage. Looking at the 2020 crop, what we've seen so far versus some historical data through the lab. We're going to focus on fiber content and fiber digestibility, and starch digestibility as a big portion of that corn silage talk. Depending on time, I'll touch on some haylage quality as well. So yeah, diving into corn silage, we took this slide from Dr. Bill Weiss at Ohio State. That he's used this in some presentations. You know, the big thing with corn silage, the partitioning of energy from different nutrients. You know, as you can see here, the two biggies are the starch and the NDF, and of course the digestibility of the NDF. With between the starch and the NDF accounting for 73% of the energy contents of corn silage on average. So that's kind of the basis behind why I'm going to focus on the starch and the NDF contents mostly. We'll dive into the crude protein and some other nutrients a little bit, but mainly on that NDF and the starch. So we'll move along here. So yeah, the 2020 corn silage crop season, I divided off here in this left column here, all samples that were identified as coming from Iowa. And then in the middle column is all samples that we've seen through all of our lab locations for the 2020 crop. And then the column all the way to the right would be all samples from 2000 crop year through currently here. So comparing, you know, the new crop versus old crop, you know, first moisture contents. You know, in general, obviously the Iowa samples and all samples were in that 65 to 65.5 area, and you compare to the historical data at 64.6. So we're close, trended a little wetter, which is probably good. I think last year and probably the last couple of years, there's been some challenging areas to get corn silage chopped when we wanted to get it chopped, which led to some drier samples, which I think is why we see just that little change this year versus the historical data. We're a little wetter, which is good. Moving along to crude protein. The Iowa samples averaging 8% protein, all samples 7.8, and the historical 7.6. Like I said, I'm not gonna touch on crude protein a whole lot. In my mind, crude protein, I mean, it's an important metric, but on corn silage, probably not the biggest important nutrient to be focusing in on. Certainly on hay and hay crop silages, the protein is more valuable. NDF, as you can see here, the Iowa samples trended about a point higher than all of our sample data for the 2020 samples. Versus the historical 3-year samples at 37.3. So, you know, not a huge difference there, pretty similar. Moving along to the NDFD or NDF digestibility at 30 hours. The Iowa samples at 60.9, all samples at 60.5. When you compare it to the 3-year data at 58.1, that's a significant increase, or what I would consider a significant increase in NDF digestibility, which is a good trend. Obviously, I think we've had the upper Midwest has had some weather challenges. I would say more so the last couple of years with probably some excessively wet areas, probably contributing to this lower NDFD in previous years versus this year. Moving along to the UNDF 240. That is the undigestible or indigestible NDF at 240 hours in vitro digestion. Of course, this number we want to be lower if we can. And you look at the Iowa samples at 9.4, all samples 9.3, and then the historical at 9.9. So we did trend down there as well, which is a good thing. Starch content, the average starch content for the Iowa samples we've seen is 33 versus all samples at 34.9 and historical data at 34.8. So just a slight trend, a little lower for the Iowa samples, but in general, we're in the same ballpark there. So as you see, back to the Iowa samples, you know, that NDF is a point higher, that starch is a point to 2 lower. So, you know, your NDF and starch are going to be inverse to one another for the most part. One thing I want to kind of touch on here too is moving along to the ash contents. One thing that looks a little negative in this year's data versus the historical data is the ash content trending a little bit higher. The Iowa data at 6.0% ash, all samples for 2020 at 5.4, and then all historical data at 5.0. So that's a little bit concerning that we have a few more higher ash samples. Then the calculated milk per ton energy values, the Iowa data at 3,321 pounds of milk per ton. all samples at 3,393 versus the historical data. So, you know, in a general, they're pretty similar across the board there on the milk per ton values. Moving along, I did separate out some BMR corn silage. I know there's some interest in people what we see for BMR or samples that are labeled as BMR samples. So the column furthest to the left here are BMR samples for the 2020 crop, and then BMR samples for the last 3 years. And then comparing those two columns I already had on the previous slide with all samples from 2020 crop versus all for the 3 previous years. And you can see there that, you know, in general, the NDFDs, I'll focus on that, the NDF digestibilities. This year's BMR is 66.7 versus the previous 3 years, 63.8. So I would say that's a significant increase in the NDF digestibility on BMRs as well. And there goes hand in hand, the UNDF 240 values are lower in this year's BMR as well versus previous. There is a touch lower starch content there versus the previous, you know, the 3-year historical data, 31.9 versus 33.1, you know, so a little over a point less starch. But that NDFD was a significant increase to kind of offset that. There again, there's a slight increase in the ash contents versus historical data and a slight increase in the milk per ton values. Here we're going to look at some distribution data of this new crop versus the 3-year values. Crude protein quick. You can see the green distribution of samples for protein, you know, the range of what, about 5.5 to 10. And obviously the big majority of the data in that 7.5 to 8.5 range with a slight increase in the crude proteins versus the historical 3-year data. Here I was going to hit on the ash contents a little bit again. As I mentioned, the brown distribution is the 3-year distribution of ash contents in corn silage versus the green distribution is the new crop data. As you can see, you know, there's a fair amount of, you know, increased ash content, some higher ash samples. So that's something to keep an eye on, I guess. Here's the distribution on the NDF or total fiber contents. There again, that's pretty similar to our historical data on the total NDFs. But here's where we see some significant change from historical data is in that NDFD 30-hour value. You can see, you know, a pretty good swing to the right there where we're increasing those NDF digestibilities. So getting a greater percentage of samples off to the right, which is good, you know, increase in digestibility. And then the inverse here is the UNDF 240 values. Pretty normal distribution there on the 2020 samples versus the old crop or the 3-year values, but it's a pretty good slide to the left with a lower UNDF values. Here I just wanted to kind of, I like to look at NDF digestion in a digestion curve, or some people would call it a decay curve. So here I broke out the Iowa 2020 samples, and then again the all samples would be all 2020 samples through all of our labs, and then the brown line would be the 3-year data. So this is just basically showing the NDF to begin with. They're all between 35 and 40, with the Iowa data just about a point higher than the others on the NDFs. But you get out to say 30 hours of digestion, where most of the digestion is occurring in that first 30 hours. So again, I probably should have referenced the x-axis here is the number of hours of digestion. So as you go, then we measure an NDF at 30 hours. And obviously, you know, all three of these data points are rather close, so it's kind of hard to separate them out. But I just kind of wanted to demonstrate, you know, your typical corn silage digestion curve. As you can see, these kind of track all together, so there's not a huge difference, but you do see the lower UNDFs on the new crop versus the 3-year. Slightly there, but it is definitive when you get down to the UNDFs a little bit there. Milk per ton. Milk per ton's been a pretty popular value to try to value corn silages for an energy contents. Here you can see that distribution of the 2020 samples would be the green distribution again versus the brown for the 3-year data. Very similar on the distributions there again. Just a slight trend to have a few more of the average, the higher values, and a few less on the low end. Starch contents. Here again, the 3-year data is the brown distribution versus the green. And then starch, we do have a few more on the low end and actually a few more on the high end and a few less in the middle of this distribution. But in general, just a tad lower on the Iowa starch contents and corn silages, but all data was pretty similar. Here I'm gonna begin to kind of break down starch digestibility and what we're seeing through the lab with the IBSD7, which IBSD7 stands for in vitro starch digestibility at 7 hours. I wanted to compare this year's new crop data, so the September, October 2020 samples versus September and October of 2019, so that we're comparing similar data points as far as unfermented or early fermented new crop samples from one year to another. And as you can see here, the median value of 69.5 is actually spot on with the median value from last year's in vitro 7 hours at the same time period. So yeah, not a lot of difference in starch digestibility from what we're seeing thus far on the new crop. Here I just kind of wanted to delve into kind of showing what our historical in vitro 7-hour data is kind of across the board on the average dry corn, average high moisture corn, average ear corn snaplage, average corn silage, to kind of give you an idea of comparing that corn silage data that we just looked at versus some other starch sources. As you can see here, dry corn typically averages 47% digestible at 7 hours. High moisture corn, which I consider over 25% moisture, that averages 63. The ear corn and snaplages, 66% digestible at 7 hours. And then the average corn silage at 73%. Here's kind of a neat graphic breaking down the average in vitro 7-hour value by month of the year. All the way on the left side would be like your beginning of the crop season. So beginning of last year's crop season. I just wanted to have this graphic to demonstrate, you know, how those digestibilities typically change with the fermentation. So that's the big thing with this fermentation change. You see the brown line would be the average 7-hour starch value by month. So here in September, October, we're typically with an average of 65, 66, and then moving on up to an average value in the 75 to 77 range when you get typical fully fermented samples. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of demonstrate, you know, obviously a big part of the starch digestibility metric comes from fermenting the crop and getting that starch softened up so we get the most bang for our buck out of the starch from the corn silage. Moving along here, we also summarized what I think is pretty neat corn silage processing scores over time. And a few key points here on this slide. I think we've done an amazing job as an industry at improving corn silage processing scores. If you look back, this data goes all the way back to 2010 and all the way to current. So again, the green line is the average corn silage processing score over time. And then all of the black dots are individual samples. And then so a corn silage processing score less than 50 would be considered inadequate processing. Then the blue area there would be considered adequate, and that's from 50 to 70. And then above 70, corn silage processing score would be considered optimum. So you can kind of see that whole, as a whole, we've trended better as an industry, improving corn silage processing scores. There is a little bit of a trend downward with the most recent data on the graphic, but I would point out that part of that is the slug of new crop samples there. As you can see, once we hit new crop, we do get a slug of samples that are a little bit lower. And you can kind of see that year to year, we get that same slug of samples early on, and the ones that are unfermented and coming right out of the field. But of course, those corn silage processing scores can change with fermentation. Some of that starch softens up, kernels soften up in fermentation in the bunker, in the silo, and lowers that particle size. Here, this slide just kind of demonstrates the normal distribution of corn silage processing scores that we see through the lab. And again, this is trending year to year. In general, it's trending better. So the x-axis here is the corn silage processing scores, you know, with the brown area being the inadequately processed, the blue area being the adequately processed from 50 to 70, and the ones that are over a 70 corn silage processing score being the green area. So obviously there's still some that are in that brown territory, but in general, we've trended better in that regard. Moving along, another metric that the folks can use when we're getting into new crop corn silage to determine starch digestibility and what we're getting out of it is to actually measure the starch in the manure. And here again, I think over the years here at Dairyland, we've, tracking dairy fecal starch data. We've trended to have lower dairy fecal starch values, which in general is good. So we get more out of that corn grain that's going into the diets. So on this graphic, the x-axis again is the amount of starch in those fecal samples. And the University of Wisconsin came up with an interpretation guidelines here. The 0 to 3 is considered no need to investigate. 3 to 5 being kind of a borderline, and over 5 being the ones that we need to investigate further as far as where that starch is coming from and why we have so much starch in the manure. I know since they came out with those interpretation guidelines, I know a lot more nutritionists and farms that are, obviously trying to tighten that up even further and trying to get that starch in the manure down to 1% or less, which can be potentially attainable as long as, the starch is very digestible and things are working well in the total diets. I guess with that, I'm kind of finished up with the corn silage portion of the presentation. So here I'm gonna touch on some alfalfa and mixed alfalfa data that we've seen through the lab here thus far this year. So yeah, here the left column would be the samples that have come out of your territory in Iowa. The middle column being all samples through all of our labs for 2020 Alfalfa Haylage crop. And then the column on the right would be all samples for the last 3 years. I guess here, when you go nutrient by nutrient, the crude proteins are very similar, this crop versus historical data. There again, the NDF contents, there's a slight trend for lower NDF in the Iowa samples and all samples, but the Iowa samples are a little bit lower, which is good. NDFDs on the Iowa samples are 47.7, all samples 48.4 versus the historical at 47.4. So a slight trend up in digestibility, not much, but a slight trend up. The UNDF 240 data, just a slight trend down versus the historicals. Ash contents, 11.5 on the Iowa data, all samples at 11.2, and then all samples for the last 3 years, 11.1. So there's a slight, very slight trend up on the ash contents. Moving along to the RFV, or the relative feed value. You know, there again, that goes back to the ADF and NDF contents to calculate the RFVs. So with the NDF being slightly lower than historical data, the RFV of 152 on the average Iowa sample, 154 on all samples through all of our labs versus the historical data at 150. So a slight trend up on the RFVs. And there again, RFQ takes into consideration the NDF digestibilities. So there again, a slight trend in the right direction on the RFQ contents at 161 versus the 156. And then looking at the lastly there, the milk per ton values, there again, a slight trend up, and mainly because of the NDFD content, or the NDF digestibilities being increased. Next here, just looking at what we call alfalfa and mixed haylage category on our end. So we get a lot of, you know, what are considered mixed haylage or alfalfa mixed haylage. So alfalfa with some amount of grass mixed in. It does seem like there's going to be more and more of this type of thing going on in certain areas. So here they're looking at the Iowa data in the left column versus the middle column would be all samples for 2020 crop. And then the right column would be your last 3 years data. Here again, the crude proteins across the board are pretty similar. The Iowa data at 20.5, all samples at 20.3, and then the previous 3 years, 20.3. Pretty similar across the board. Total NDF content, looks like the Iowa data trends a little bit lower in NDF content, which is good. About a point lower than all of Dairyland data, and about 1.5 points lower than the last 3 year data. I tend to think the Iowa samples probably lean heavier towards the alfalfa and not quite so much grass mix because of this NDF trend. And one of the reasons I say that too is because the NDFD here, the NDFD data for Iowa on the alfalfa mixed haylages at 48.8 versus all of our lab data at 50.7. So that in particular is why the Iowa data is somewhat a little more limited on total sample volume. And so I think it leans a little heavier to the alfalfa. It's lower in NDF, which is good, but it's a little lower in NDFD versus all samples that we've seen through all labs. But versus the 3 year data, the NDFD is still higher than the 3 year historical NDFD. UNDF 240, there again, the Iowa samples trend just a touch lower than the last 3 year data, but it's a little bit higher than all of our labs. Ash contents, you know, there again, we're pretty similar trend across the board there. The Iowa samples at 11.3, 10.7 on all samples 2020, and then all samples the last 3 years 10.7. So pretty similar across there. RFV, you know, there again, pretty similar to the alfalfa data, just a slight trend up in RFV in the Iowa samples and all samples for 2020 for the 2020 crop. versus the historical data at 144 RFV. RFQ, there again, we have a little nicer trend up with the NDFDs being higher in this year's crop versus old crop. And lastly there, the milk per tons, again, a nice slight trend up with the NDFDs being slightly higher this year. And I guess with that, I've probably gone through my slides a little fast, but certainly I guess we have at least plenty of time for discussion or questions or anything like that. I say I apologize for probably going through the slides a little too fast. We can certainly, if anybody has particular questions, I can go back and we can take a look at a slide again or anything like that.
At this point, because we've got a fairly small group, if somebody wants to unmute and ask a question directly, I think we can handle that pretty easily. Otherwise, I'll start. Are we seeing the higher ash due to more down forage crops?
I think that could be a contributing factor, certainly in certain areas would be, yeah, down crop, or I do think there's probably been some certain other areas that that may have gotten higher ash contents from maybe from some other reasons. If they got rain, you know, rains prior to harvest, and then they happen to be either dragging some mud up on the pile with either a packing tractor or with the trucks or wagons dumping in the bunker. You do see some of that regionally in certain areas that that got wet prior to harvest. And there again too, there's some territory too that's piles on dirt. So certainly that can contribute to some of the samples as well with piles on dirt. You can certainly contaminate the crop with dirt in that aspect.
Neal, this is Eugene Rodberg with Chemin, and just real quickly, haylage sample, the haylage samples. Do you see seasonal variations in some of the digestibilities that don't really show up in these data because these are compiled data? But do you see spring haylages are different than late season haylages?
Yeah. Good afternoon, Eugene. Yeah, we honestly, I didn't break out this data by crop or when they were submitted as far as early in the crop season versus late. But historically, when I've broken out previous year's data, yeah, we certainly see that. You know, certainly digestibilities tend to be higher in first crop on an average year versus say second and third crops that are growing when it's hotter. Yeah, in general, you know, I think some of those second and third crops, we can tend to see higher relative feed values, but you can tend to see lower digestibilities. So then lower RFQs on the mid-season crops, and especially if it's, you know, extreme heat and stress on that alfalfa. And when I say typical years, I think this year in a lot of our territory in the upper Midwest, I think we as an industry probably had a better chance at getting a good first crop up this year, which is good. I think the previous, seems like the previous few years, there's been more challenges to get a quote unquote typical first crop where you would get, you know, that chance to get higher digestibility. But yeah, it did seem like in general this year, we kind of lean towards having a better first crop, which is good. But like I say, long story short, to answer your question, I think in general, we do see, you know, greater digestibility in first crop, but we also see greater digestibility in some of the late cuttings. You know, some of these fall cuttings can be really nice digestibility in that too, so. Any other questions?
I don't want to monopolize all the time, but when you're the samples you're seeing with the growing interest in cover crops, are you starting to see more mixed alfalfa samples coming in as an N? And I guess, are you seeing more varieties of different kinds of silages, small grain silages, et cetera, coming in?
Yeah, I would definitely say that there's a definite trend upwards in, yeah, and like you mentioned, cover crop silages being harvested. Whether that's triticale or some other small grain silage. It does also seem like there's a trend in some of these what seed companies are calling cocktail mixes. I don't know if you run into much of that in your neck of the woods, but it does seem like we're seeing more of what are called cocktail mixes, which can be just that, a cocktail of different grasses. I think most of them have some sort of sorghum Sudan grass, but a cocktail with some Italian ryegrass and maybe some clovers in it. Does seem like we're seeing more of that type of thing going on, and probably for a number of reasons. I know last year one of the reasons was there was a fair amount of winter kill again with the alfalfa, and a lot of dairies were scrambling for feed, period. So a lot of them went to doing things like these cocktail blends or even straight sorghum Sudan grass. But I do think that there's a definite trend and interest in some of those different forage crops for a variety of reasons. I know another big thing is the manure management or nutrient management on a lot of dairies. Some of these crops give these dairies an opportunity to spread manure more during the middle of the season rather than having to wait so late in the fall after harvesting corn silage to spread most of the manure or incorporate most of the manure late. Some of these crops give more of an opportunity to utilize the manure on some grass mixes and things like that. Any further questions?
On
Do you have
these,
any group analyses of some of the cocktail mixes as they come in?
I honestly didn't. I didn't do that for this presentation, but I could potentially do that to share with the group down the road here. I'm sure the number of samples is probably fairly limited to get good normal ranges, especially when it be just new crop versus old crop. But like I say, I could certainly do that and share with the group if you'd like. I know just anecdotally and seeing some individual samples through the lab, there again, I think some of those cocktails tend to be more the digestibilities tend to be higher in the early and late cuttings, because if those cocktails have some of the Italian ryegrass, it seems like the early and late cuttings have a higher volume of Italian ryegrass in the early and late cuttings, and during the warmer part of the growing season, it would have more of the sorghum Sudan grass. But yeah, in general, pretty highly digestible stuff we've seen in some of those cocktail blends. Any other questions?
on your slide where you looked at milk per ton and corn silage, was that bump because of the use of BMR?
Oh, I guess I would probably have to divide that out better to disseminate how many BMR samples, if the percentage of BMR samples went up versus the previous 3-year data. I'm actually somewhat doubtful because there's so much. I think the big thing is, in general, when you look at the difference in NDFD, I think of all this data that I presented today, I think the biggest change, I think potentially from the historical data, is the NDFD in corn silage in general being increased, which is a very good thing. And I think it makes sense with the growing season that we had in a majority of the upper Midwest. I know you all in parts of Iowa probably got drier earlier than we did here in Wisconsin, but in general, I think digestibility goes hand in hand with, you tend to have a little higher digestibility in when it's a little drier, actually, versus previous couple of years. It seems like we've had some fair amount of territory that's been excessively wet. And I think that's contributed to some of the lower digestibilities in previous crops on the corn silage. But certainly there's definitely regional pockets in, you know, whether it's Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, where you're going to have some regional differences. And, you know, sometimes, like anything, timing is everything. If your neighbor was able to get it in 3 weeks earlier than you did, you know, maybe the timing one way or the other helped you out. But any other thoughts or questions or comments?
Well, if there's no other questions, Neal, if I could get you to unshare your slides, I'll go
Yep.
ahead and share mine. And we'll well, I'm having some difficulties finding my, there we go. This presentation has been recorded and will be archived on the Iowa State Extension Dairy Team website. And there is the link for that. And I'd like to remind everyone to, after you've viewed the webinar, to go ahead and click on this link and do a very short evaluation for us so we can use that in our planning. Thank you, Neal, for the presentation, some slides that really brought some things home as far as some changes. At this point, I would go ahead and log off, and we'll see you at our next program in November. And that will be on what's in the new sire summaries with Dr. James Coltus. Thank you again.
Thank you. Have a great day.